everybody. This is my second video back in a long time, and today I'm going to go over some interview tips for people that have recently just graduated or might be heading into the career of education. My disclaimer is that I graduated in December of 2020, so I'm really new to this and I'm really new to the career of education. I have only had 2 interviews and I got a call back from a few different places. I had 4 or 5 interviews lined up for a week once schools went back, which was like January 4th. And the first one that I went to was for a long-term sub job. Just finished my long-term sub in 3rd grade, and on Monday I'll be in 1st grade for my first week. So this is what I've compiled from those 2 interviews. So I really don't know how qualified I am to talk about interviews yet, but I did get a job right out of college, and I do have a list of questions that they asked me. When I had my interview, I brought this portfolio with me, and in it is a little folder that I had a bunch of things in and a notepad. So on the notepad, I wrote questions to ask during my interview. So I had 3 questions that were prepared ahead of time for me to ask during my interview. Definitely have questions to ask, and I tend to forget them, so it's good to write them down. I had also written down the standards for the grades, or at least some of them, so that I was familiar with them in case I had to refer to them. I didn't end up having to do that, so I don't know how helpful it was for me. So here are some things that I brought with me to my interview in case you're curious about that as well. So in my little portfolio in the folder, I had a copy of my resume, 3 copies of my references, resources that I had created. So this was a math game and practice for multiplication that I did during student teaching. And this was parent communication, a newsletter that I had done, my favorite lesson from my unit all typed up and printed out so that I could give it to them to look at. So on my resume, which my principal had said that they had never seen before, is a QR code to my online portfolio, which I have been making since my senior year of college. In terms of interview prep, I was really nervous for my first interview. I went completely overboard. I asked on my teacher Instagram for questions that people got. I asked for advice. I asked for examples of things, what to bring. I was so nervous, but that is what I think helped me to get the position that I'm in now, because I was really rusty on interview skills. So all that preparation that I did and put into that first interview really helped when I went to my second interview and got my first job. These questions are all from people that follow me on my teacher Instagram, which is @Callie'sClass if you want to give it a follow. First question was, explain the best and worst lesson that you have given. What is your understanding of standardized testing? They definitely ask about classroom management styles. How well do you know the standards, which is what made me prep with all the standards because somebody had sent that. If you could sell tickets to a lesson, what would it be? Which I thought was kind of a fun one. Describe a time when you had overcome a challenge. What are your strengths and weaknesses? What is the biggest indicator of a successful lesson? What would you do if a student told you they were being bullied? How do you integrate your interest into the classroom? Loved that one. Collecting data. How do you collect data? How do you differentiate in the classroom? What do you use for parent communication, which is why I brought that newsletter. Why did you want to become a teacher? How would you handle a consistently disruptive student? This is a hard question, and to this day I still don't really know the answer to it because I feel like it varies by the student. How do you cultivate positive relationships in classroom community? How can you support students with learning disabilities? How can you support literacy, and especially in EL students? How do you integrate technology into the classroom? What questions do you have for us? Which led me into a whole different thing of what questions to ask at an interview, which I also have here. And last one was, what is your teaching style and philosophy? So these are all ones that I got from Instagram. I also looked up on Google and watched some YouTube videos that had lists and advice on interviewing. So this was my whole list of questions that I used to prepare me for my first interview and the interviews after that. That leads me into the questions to ask at an interview. I already read you the 3 that I went for after coming up with this list, but what do you have for a new teacher mentor program? What is the community involvement like? What are some ways to be involved in the community? What does a typical day look like in this classroom? What is one thing you want to improve on in your school and one thing that your school excels at? What is the dress code for your school? What is the social media policies for your school? What do you love about the school and what are you most proud of? What kind of professional development do you offer at your school? How is technology implemented in the classroom here? What do you look for in your school's teachers and teammates? And how do you build a school family were some of the ones that I came up with and found in my research process in preparation for interviewing. One big thing that I did do, I have a friend who is currently a teacher, and they offered to meet me on FaceTime or Zoom and give me some practice questions and go over some answers for them and like how I might answer them and give me some tips and tricks and stuff like that. I have 9 questions on here that were like the key ones that they came up with. I also wrote down some answers on how that I would. So my first one was, tell me about yourself in 3 to 4 sentences. So when they say tell me about yourself, they don't want something super long and cliche. They just want like an elevator speech. They want your background. You want to talk about like what school you went to, what your major was, some jobs that you might have had, some things you're passionate about. And then at the end, you might want to say like, I enjoy this or that, and I incorporate it into a lesson through doing this or that. So that helps you talk about integrating curriculum. And second one was, what are your strengths and challenges? The important part about the challenges part is talking about how you're planning to improve your challenges or your weaknesses. You might say that your strength is meeting diverse needs, adjustment to practice, time management, creating lessons. My challenge I wrote was being a first-year teacher in a pandemic, so equitable access to learning at home, teaching remotely. Although I did kind of do that student teaching, they were mostly not remotely because I stayed in the classroom full time. You would then say, I would like to improve it by having a work-life balance, classroom management, anything like that. You can also talk about routines and expectations of a classroom here, how you want to continue the structure that's already there. That was important for me because I was doing a long-term sub position. So you want to keep the same routines that the students are used to. So that was important for me to know. A lesson that went well and why. I just wrote down my best lesson that I ever taught and why I enjoyed it so much. So just reflecting on the lessons that you did teach during student teaching or in your career. And then in addition to that, also a lesson that went not so great. And so I wrote down that lesson and why it didn't go great and what I did to then improve it. So during student teaching, we had to create a 5-lesson unit plan. So I taught my 5 lessons. My 4th lesson was my favorite and what I felt was my strongest one and the one that I had the most fun with. So that was my favorite and my lesson that went well. For my lesson that went not so great, it was actually my 2nd lesson of my unit. I realized that the students needed more practice, they needed more time, and I altered the complete rest of my unit, so lessons 2, 3, 4, and 5 to fit the needs of those students. So that is what I would talk about for my favorite lesson or a lesson that went really great and a lesson that went not so great. The 5th question that we practiced was, how do you use technology in the classroom? This was a very big one in both of the interviews that I went to, so I know that it's really important, especially now where things are doing remote learning and stuff like that. So I wrote that I got Google certified as a student teacher, but it's more about how you integrate technology. So using videos, virtual manipulatives. I wrote down some examples of some virtual assignments that I had created. I did one for Thanksgiving. I adapted some paper copies of a lesson or worksheets to be online. And then I also had like a fun Halloween Google Docs activity that I created. So I wrote down all 3 of those as examples of how I use technology. The next question on the list that I had prepared with was, how do you collaborate with the staff? So for me, this was kind of easy because I had my mentor teacher, but I also worked with the other grade level teachers and observed them throughout my whole student teaching experience. I talked about how I worked with teachers to plan a takeover. I attended weekly staff meetings. I collaborated with the special ed teacher. I wrote how it's important to prepare your materials for lessons early for special ed teachers so that they can adapt it and modify it for the needs of your students. The next question kind of ties into that is, how do you differentiate your instruction? My immediate thought was challenging students who finish things early, or gifted learners per se, the skill levels of students who have low needs or high needs. So then you want to talk about graphic organizers, sentence frames. I wrote down that you can have students start early or finish later, modeling and scaffolding, so like KWL charts, building knowledge, introducing things, pre-teaching vocabulary. All of those are examples on how you can differentiate a lesson. You can also pair students in different ways in small groups. What are your classroom management techniques? And I wrote down having clear expectations and directions. I always made slides with instructions and like what to do next type things. And then I starred this one. It was structure and routines. And again, for me, this was for a long-term sub position. So I wanted to continue what the teacher already does and not change up much for the students that I would be teaching. I tried counting down from 5. I tried callbacks. I did heads down. I did so many different things. So this is where you would kind of brainstorm the things that you tried out student teaching or in your past teaching careers. For me, it helped me to have like a list of things that I tried beforehand so that I wasn't trying to think of them on the spot, because that is what I am really bad with on interviews, which is why right now I'm like looking down at all of these papers to help me with this video, because I get so nervous about talking about stuff like this and like not saying the right things. So I have it all written down from like when I did my interview prep, and I'm just using that to tell you about what I did. The last page of notes that I have written down are the questions that I have been asked so far in an interview. So I think I forgot a couple of them by the time I wrote them down, but I was trying to keep a list of questions that were popular that I got asked. So my first interview, they asked me about technology in the classroom. They asked me how I would handle a student with a difficult behavior. They asked me the role of a general education teacher versus the special education teacher and how they work together, which was really important. They asked me about weaknesses and concerns that I have going into the position, which caught me off guard a little bit because I knew my own weaknesses, but I didn't really know my concerns about going into a position. They asked me about creativity in the classroom. Another question they asked was about classroom management. This is like a given in any interview that you ever get, so if you don't have it, I'd be surprised, so definitely practice that one. The last question was how you differentiate in the classroom, which I talked about already. Super important, definitely popular for interviews, as well as the technology question. Those are like top 3 that I get a lot of. In the second interview that I had, which is the job that I am in now, they asked me the tell me about yourself question, which is the elevator speech that I talked about. They asked me how familiar I am with guided reading groups, so definitely that was something that kind of caught me off guard as well, since I hadn't really prepared for that, and in pandemics they don't really teach you that. So this was for first grade, so they definitely have guided reading groups, but I was nervous because I haven't done them in about 8 months. The next question I have that they asked me was, how do you collaborate with a teacher? Which was one of the ones that I prepared for and knew that I had a really great answer for, so that one was easy for me. And then the last one was experience with Google Classroom and technology. And I didn't write down ones that were repeated. So those were the questions that I got asked in the 2 interviews that I have had. And then after your interview, you want to send an email to the people that you had your interview with. Probably like that night or a couple of hours after your interview, you can link your portfolio in it. You can send another copy of your resume. You can do anything you want. Just use like a standard template saying, thank you for interviewing me. Thank you for taking the time. I hope to hear back from you soon. I'm excited about this position, etc. Anything like that. And then if you have multiple people that interviewed you, you want to make sure that you email individually each person. That is everything that I had prepped for when I had my interviews, and I wish everybody good luck for any interviews that you have coming up, and I hope that this helped. Make sure to follow my teacher Instagram. I definitely post on there more. It is at Callie's Class. You can also like this video and subscribe to my channel. I would love that. I am really going to be trying to get back into YouTube in the next coming weeks, so thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!